Imagine a room. Not a room with a view, not a room with a window that opens, not a room you chose or decorated or filled with the small artifacts of your living. Imagine a room roughly the size of a parking space 6 feet wide, 9 feet long, where the ceiling is close enough to touch if you raise your arms and stand on your toes. Imagine that the light inside never changes. That you cannot tell whether it is morning or midnight, whether it is Tuesday or Saturday, whether a week has passed or a month. Now imagine you will live in this room for 23 hours a day. Every single day. For months. For years. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a thought experiment designed by a philosopher or a novelist reaching for effect. This is and has been, for well over a century, an operating reality inside the American prison system. A reality experienced by tens of thousands of human beings on any given day. A reality so routine, so normalized within the machinery of incarceration, that most Americans have never stopped to consider what it actually does to a human mind. We are going to stop. Right here. And consider it together. The place has many names. Segregation. The hole. The box. Administrative segregation, ADSEG, in the bureaucratic shorthand that makes it sound almost benign, almost procedural, like a form you file rather than a sentence you survive. Whatever the name on the clipboard, the experience inside those walls is singular and devastating. And it is not an accident. It was designed, engineered, refined over generations with remarkable precision for a singular purpose: to break down the self. What the architects of these systems perhaps did not anticipate or perhaps did not care about is that breaking down the self does not produce order. It does not produce safer prisons or safer streets or safer communities. It produces something else entirely. Something the staff do not see on the cameras, something the administrators do not read in the incident reports. Something that happens only in the interior, in the unreachable, unpoliced country of the human mind, left alone with nothing but itself. That is what this documentary is about. To understand where we are, you have to understand where we came from. The history of solitary confinement in America does not begin with the hardened criminals and maximum security complexes of the modern imagination. It begins with Quakers, with reformers, with men and women who believed, with sincere and profound conviction, that they were doing something merciful. It was 1829. The Eastern State Penitentiary had just opened its doors in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was, by the standards of its time, a marvel, a grand Gothic structure designed with a singular philosophical intention. The Quaker reformers behind it had looked at the prisons of their era and recoiled. Overcrowded, brutal, chaotic. Places where the wicked made the impressionable worse, where punishment was public and violent, where no man emerged better than he had entered. Eastern State would be different. Eastern State would be redemptive. The theory was this: place a man alone in a cell with only a Bible and his conscience, and he would have no choice but to confront himself. The solitude would force reflection. The silence would invite God. The isolation would, in the language of the era, penitent him, make him penitent, transform his soul, return him to society as a man improved, humbled, purified. They called it the Pennsylvania system. And for a time it was celebrated around the world. Alexis de Tocqueville himself traveled to observe it, arriving in 1831 alongside his companion Gustave de Beaumont to study the American penitentiary experiment. What they wrote afterward was measured, admiring of the intention if troubled by what they witnessed. Prisoners received in total isolation. No communication. No congregation. When moved through the facility, they wore hoods over their heads so they could not see or be seen by other inmates. They existed in a designed world of one. What the reformers did not anticipate, what perhaps no one could anticipate in 1829, before the science of the mind had any meaningful vocabulary for what isolation does to it, is that the Pennsylvania system was not producing penitence. It was producing madness. Prisoners began exhibiting behaviors the wardens could not explain and did not know how to categorize. They paced their cells in obsessive patterns, the same path, the same number of steps, for hours on end. They spoke to figures no one else could see. They became convinced of elaborate inner narratives, that they were being watched through the walls, that messages were being sent through the vibrations of the floor, that the silence itself was communicating something. Some stopped speaking altogether. Some screamed until they had no voice left to scream with. Charles Dickens visited Eastern State in 1842. He was not measured in what he wrote. He was horrified. He called it a slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain. He said that those who designed it meant well, but that the effect, in many cases, was to destroy the prisoner's mind entirely. He had seen with his own eyes what no man could see unmoved, and he would not advocate its continuance on any account. The Pennsylvania system was eventually abandoned. The Auburn system, which allowed congregate labor in silence, became the American norm through the latter half of the 19th century. But the idea of isolation never disappeared. It merely went underground, institutionally speaking. It became a tool. A punishment within the punishment. A lever that wardens and guards could pull when they needed compliance, when they wanted to send a message, when they simply wanted someone to disappear from the general population for a while. And as American prisons grew as the 20th century unfolded and the carceral state expanded with it, that lever got pulled with increasing frequency. By the mid-20th century, American prisons had developed what they called special housing units, facilities designed specifically for long-term isolation. Alcatraz, the federal penitentiary that operated in San Francisco Bay from 1934 to 1963, became perhaps the most famous example. Its isolation wing, known simply as the Hole, was a place where prisoners were held in near total darkness, in silence, sometimes for weeks at a time. Men who served time there described emerging from it changed in ways they could not articulate, hollowed, somehow. As if something that had lived behind their eyes had quietly vacated while they were inside. But Alcatraz was just one facility. One famous, dramatic example. The truly seismic shift came in the 1980s and 1990s. The era of mass incarceration brought with it a proportional expansion of every mechanism of control. Prison populations exploded, tripling, quadrupling, in some states growing tenfold between 1970 and 2000. With overcrowding came fear. With fear came the perceived need for more extreme forms of management. And from that need was born the modern Supermax. In 1983, following the murders of 2 correctional officers at Marion Federal Penitentiary in Illinois, the federal government placed the entire facility under what it called permanent lockdown. All inmates were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day. It was, at the time, an emergency measure. But emergency measures have a way of becoming permanent ones. Marion became the template. In 1989, California opened Pelican Bay State Prison, a facility specifically designed for the new era of isolation. Its security housing unit became one of the most debated correctional facilities in American history. Men lived in windowless cells, alone for years. For decades. Contact with other human beings was essentially eliminated. Exercise, when available at all, took place in a small concrete enclosure alone. Meals came through a slot in the door. By 2000, there were more than 60 Supermax facilities operating across the United States. By the time we reached the second decade of the 21st century, estimates suggested that somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people were held in some form of solitary confinement on any given day in American prisons and jails. 80 to 100,000 people. Alone in boxes. Some for days, some for months, some for measured decades. And the cameras in those hallways, the cameras on the ceiling of the exercise cage, the cameras pointed at the slot in the door, they caught none of what was actually happening. Because what was actually happening was happening inside. His name was Anthony. He was 26 years old when he was placed in solitary confinement at a state prison in the American South. He had gotten into a fight he says he did not start, in a yard where not fighting back was not an option available to him. The administration had discretion. The administration used it. Anthony was sent to the security housing unit. He thought he could handle it. Most of them think they can handle it. The first week Anthony did push-ups. He counted ceiling tiles. He replayed every conversation he had ever had with his mother, with his brother, with friends from the neighborhood. Like reviewing film. Like studying for a test. He told himself he was mentally strong. He read. He thought. He would be fine. The second week he began to lose track of time. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It was subtle at first, a growing uncertainty about whether the meal being slid under the door was breakfast or dinner, whether the dim shift in light he occasionally perceived meant morning or late afternoon. The internal clock, the one human beings carry without even thinking about it, calibrated unconsciously by sunlight, by social interaction, by the texture of a day moving from one kind of activity to another, began to stutter. By the third week he didn't trust himself anymore. Not his memory, not his sense of time, not his sense of what was real. He started having conversations with people who weren't there. Not hallucinations exactly, he knew they weren't real. But he was so hungry for another voice that he started providing one. Having whole arguments with people in his head and then answering for them. And then not being sure he was the one doing the answering. Anthony's account is not exceptional. It is, according to the research conducted over the past 4 decades by psychiatrists, neurologists and psychologists who have studied solitary confinement's effects, essentially representative. Dr. Stuart Gracian was a Harvard psychiatrist who first gained access to inmates in isolation at Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts in 1982. What he documented in his landmark study changed the medical conversation about isolation permanently. He identified a specific psychiatric syndrome, a cluster of symptoms that appeared in a remarkable proportion of solitary inmates and did not have a prior name because no one had looked closely enough before. The symptoms were disturbing in their consistency. Hyperresponsivity to external stimuli and inability to filter or modulate sensory input that had grown so profound that a guard's footstep in the corridor could produce panic. Perceptual distortions. Hallucinations. Paranoia of a particular, grinding, inescapable quality. Difficulty with thinking and concentration described by inmates consistently as a kind of fogging, a thickening of the mind that made it hard to hold a thought long enough to complete it. Intrusive obsessional thoughts. And, in more extreme cases, episodes of acute psychotic decompensation, a dissolution, however temporary, of the boundary between what was real and what was not. This was not happening only to men who were already mentally ill, though the mentally ill suffered most acutely and most rapidly. It was happening to men who had entered isolation without a prior psychiatric diagnosis. It was happening to men who had entered it believing they could handle it. The tapping is something the guards notice. In facilities where inmates have been in isolation for months, a particular behavior emerges. Men begin developing elaborate, repetitive physical routines. Pacing the same exact path. Tapping the wall in a specific sequence. Arranging and rearranging the few objects they possess, a cup, a toothbrush, a photograph if they are permitted one, with a precision that becomes all-consuming. This is not simply boredom. Scientists who study the neurobiology of sensory deprivation have documented what happens to a brain deprived of adequate external stimulation over extended periods. The brain does not go quiet. The brain cannot go quiet. It is an organ built for constant input, for the processing and integration of a relentless stream of information from the world around it. When that information stream is throttled, the brain does not rest. It begins to generate its own. It floods itself. The repetitive behaviors, the pacing, the tapping, the rituals are not signs of weakness. They are adaptive. They are the mind, desperately and creatively, trying to provide itself with the stimulation it requires to function. They are, in their way, a form of ingenuity. But they are not sustainable. Robert was held in the security housing unit at Pelican Bay for 11 years. 11 years in a space roughly the size of a modest bathroom. He eventually became one of the lead plaintiffs in a hunger strike that drew international attention. But before any of that, before he had a platform or a legal team or anyone listening, he developed what he could only describe as a method. You have to create worlds, he said. Inside your head, you have to build places you can go. And you have to maintain them. Keep them detailed. Keep them real enough that you can live in them for a few hours. But there's a danger to it too. Because sometimes you go in and you don't come back all the way. Sometimes you're not sure where you are. The construction of elaborate inner worlds as a coping mechanism has been documented across multiple studies and by multiple researchers. It is both a remarkable testament to human adaptability and a marker of how profoundly the isolated mind is being deformed by its circumstances. The worlds built inside are built because the world outside has been systematically withheld. They are not a sign of flourishing. They are a sign of emergency. Consider the neuroscience for a moment. The human brain is, at its most fundamental, a social organ. It evolved in the context of group living, calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years to the presence, the faces, the voices, the unpredictability of other human beings. Mirror neurons, neural cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe another person performing it, exist because our brains are built to simulate other minds, to sync with them, to draw information from them continuously. Social interaction is not a luxury overlay on top of the real business of cognition. It is foundational to cognition itself. Deprive the brain of this categorically, systematically, over months and years, and you are not simply making someone lonely. You are altering the structure of their thinking. You are changing what their neurons do and don't do. Studies using neuroimaging have shown that social isolation produces measurable changes in brain activity patterns, particularly in regions associated with executive function, emotional regulation, and the processing of threat. The chronically isolated brain begins to behave at the neural level as if it is under perpetual siege. Marcus had been a poet before he went to prison. Not a famous poet, not a man with publications or a following. A man who wrote poems and notebooks because it organized the world for him, because it gave experience a container. He was placed in isolation following an altercation and held there for 14 months. He described later what happened to his language. Words started to go, he said. Not all at once. But he would reach for a word, a specific word, the right word, and it would be gone. Like reaching for a tool and finding the drawer empty. He would find a smaller word, a blunter word, and use that instead. And then that word would go. And he would reach for another. And then one morning he woke up and realized he couldn't finish a sentence in his own head. He would start a sentence and the end of it would just disappear. Like a road that runs out of pavement in the middle of nowhere. The deterioration of language under prolonged isolation is not anecdotal. It is clinically documented. Language, like social cognition, is a fundamentally relational capacity. It is maintained, sharpened, and exercised through use with other people. Without that use, it atrophies. Not permanently in every case. Some of what is lost can be recovered. But the recovery is slow. And for those held in isolation for years rather than months, the losses can be profound and lasting. And then there are the ones who did not recover at all. Between 2010 and 2014, researchers examining suicide rates in American correctional facilities found that inmates in solitary confinement accounted for a vastly disproportionate share of suicides despite comprising only a small fraction of the overall prison population. The numbers varied by state and by study, but the pattern was consistent. The isolated were dying by their own hands at rates that dwarfed those of the general prison population. They were not dying because they were inherently more fragile or more desperate. They were dying because they had been placed, deliberately and systematically, in conditions that the human mind cannot endure over extended periods without catastrophic consequence. They were dying because something that presented itself to the public as a tool of order and safety was, in the interior of a 6x9 cell, functioning as something else entirely. But the silence, both the literal silence of the cell and the institutional silence that surrounded what was happening inside it, was beginning to crack. Advocates were gathering accounts. Researchers were publishing findings. Inmates who survived were speaking. And in courtrooms across the country, lawyers were beginning to assemble arguments that would reach all the way to the highest court in the land. The question they were bringing was, in its simplest form, ancient. What does the Constitution permit us to do to a human being? And what happens when the answer to that question has been wrong for more than a century? What Anthony and Robert and Marcus experienced in their cells: the unraveling of time, the erosion of language, the interior worlds built as lifeboats, the desperate rhythms tapped against concrete. These were not personal failures. They were not the results of weakness or instability or insufficient will. They were the documented, predictable, scientifically measurable consequences of a system operating exactly as designed. And the design was the problem.